A backwater frozen in time. That's how many New Zealanders saw their country in 1981. We all worked 9 to 5 Monday to Friday, and after that, the shops were shut. Everything from interest rates to wages were frozen, and our Kiwi dollar was set at a fixed rate. Amidst this peaceful and stable scenario, there was one man more than any other who controlled our lives. Robert Muldoon. But he came dangerously close to ruining that stability over rugby. All around the world, countries were refusing to play sport with South Africa in protest at its racist apartheid regime. But when it was announced that the Springboks were to tour New Zealand, the first team to come here for nearly 20 years, Muldoon would not make a stand. The result for New Zealand was virtual civil war.
Rugby Union is going to go ahead with the tour. I'm convinced of that. The government doesn't want it to go ahead. In accordance with our policy, we are not going to stop them.
New Zealand's passionate rugby fans were adamant the tour should go ahead. In an unprecedented action, they even took to the streets shouting slogans and wielding placards. Faced with such strong feelings on both sides, from rugby fans and anti-tour protesters, the police began training specialist riot squads. Operation Rugby was born. When the Springbok plane touched down at Auckland Airport on July 19, 1981, no one, not even those riot squads, realised what was to come. The next 10 weeks were to change New Zealand forever.
In 1981, I was a very young reporter doing general news with TV1 News, and I ended up as one of dozens of reporters who ended up covering almost the entire Springbok tour from beginning to end. And I ended up a very vastly different person from the one that probably started out.
The eyes of the world are on Gisborne, for they face the arrival of not only the Springboks, but as many as 1,000 demonstrators, up to 1,000 police, nearly 20,000 rugby fans, some 80 journalists, including 12 from Fleet Street, and 16 film crews, at least half of them from overseas.
A quiet, old-fashioned town with 7 Maori to every Pākehā seemed a diplomatic place to start the tour. Gisborne was isolated from the big cities with only a small anti-tour movement, and it was the home of Māoridom. The government organised a welcome for the Springbok team at Te Poho a Rawiri Marae. But even this symbolic move aroused bitter dissension.
I felt a responsibility as a Māori to actually come here to my marae and say, I don't agree with this. When we came up here that night, there were wardens and a barrier across there. My uncle was one of the wardens in charge, and I just walked through and said, Kia ora, uncle, and walked through up to the gate. When I got here, they told me that I wasn't allowed in the marae. I was angry about that. I was upset about that. I think I cried out there outside the gate. The Springbok team arrived in a bus, and I just heard banging down here. Obviously, they'd been attacked by some people down here. We stood outside the gate over there, about 50 or 60 of us, kaumatu and kuia, and young Māori people who are opposed to this welcome.
The official welcome caused deep rifts within Māoridom, and even the Māori Council was divided. When it was the turn of the Council's president, Graham Latimer, to address the Springboks, he welcomed them, then laid down an almighty challenge.
We will not be making another such welcome on the Māori Marae unless your government can show it is prepared to change its policies on apartheid.
I know that people who are pro-tour would say, well, one of our teachings is that we Manaki visitors, we give them hospitality and we take care of them. But this just wasn't an issue of the Springbok tour. There were many parallels between what happened to the black people in South Africa at that time, under the apartheid system, and things that are happening for Māori people in our country.
I remember being down on the East Coast with this black South African man, and one of the kaumātuas, Tommy Tamaro, said, well, it's all very well for us to be concerned about the black people in South Africa and the coloured people, but what about our issues here? I said, well, what is that? And he said, well, our language, our land. So it was a kind of awakening for me about looking back into our own backyard and really examining what was happening to us. So we had to start teaching Pākehā people who were with us on the Tū issue about the racism here in New Zealand.
And that's what gave it the added zing, the added power throughout that entire tour, was the fact that we were fighting out by proxy our own racial problems that we couldn't confront ourselves. In those days, we weren't confronting the treaty issues, we weren't confronting issues of racial discrimination at home, but we felt much more comfortable about fighting out those arguments on an international level.
No one knew what would happen at that first Springbok game. The police lines formed, the barricades were rolled into place, and an eerie silence descended, until the first protests.
We were filming outside the Springboks Hotel, and the crowd of demonstrators were slinging insults at the police, calling them racists, calling them fascists. And I can remember thinking to myself, this is dumb, this is, a kind of strange head-butting was already going on verbally. And my sympathies, actually, I felt very sorry for the cops at the time because, they were standing there quite impassively, and I remember making a mental note that the police were actually quite disciplined.
A specialist riot squad had been flown in, swelling police numbers to over 300. The police thought they could cope, but the fans and protesters kept pouring into town.
We had a committee in Central Auckland that sort of basically coordinated all the stuff for the 81 tour. I had to organise a van, basically, that was one of my things. We had to get people down there, so we all piled in and drove to Gisborne in the middle of the night. And it was great. Gisborne was a great adventure, really. On one arm, I had this guy who was an orchardist in Gisborne. He was in the National Party, just a fairly young guy. And he was just really incensed about the whole apartheid issue, and nothing else would have ever riled him that much to get him out on the streets like this. And he was on one arm, and there was a mongrel mob guy on my other arm, and he was great. He was just into it as well. There's whole piles of different people like that. And on his arm was the orchardist's wife, this little tiny woman. And she must have felt really uncomfortable, but it just seemed ironic, that there was such a huge mixture of people just in this little group of 4 or 5 of us. And these were middle New Zealand staunch as, totally, National Party, salt of the earth sort of people.
As the game started, 5 protesters tried to make it onto the field. The 20,000-strong crowd, more than the entire population of Gisborne, seemed unperturbed. They were not aware that 400 more protesters were on their way.
So when we got to the ground, we were coming in across the golf course at the back of the stadium. The whole march fanned out, and people started linking arms, and marched across the golf course in this huge wave. It was a fantastic feeling.
I was in the front line as we went across the golf course, and we could see the crowd on the bank turning around and facing the fence and looking at us, because with the banners and this big group of people marching across the golf course was quite impressive.
Despite the approaching mob, the rugby continued, fierce and fast. By the end of the first half, the Springboks were leading Poverty Bay 10-0.
At that time, we'd had days and days of rain here, and all the dips in the golf course were full of water. There were a lot of lakes, and we had to walk straight through them. Like, I can remember my trousers being in mud up to my knees.
We managed to walk that entire distance without a policeman being in sight, and they only arrived there by sprinting from the front of the stadium, where they'd probably been ordered to stand, no doubt. God knows how the police work, but they weren't very reactive. But it was a silly mistake on our half. If we had have gone around to behind the goalposts, we would have been able to charge straight through because there was no bank there. But in the heat of the moment, we just charged at the most inaccessible point in the whole bloody ground.
And I had relatives in the police force there on the bank. Whānau, friends and policemen who I work with in my work as a social worker. So that was quite scary, not knowing what was going to happen.
The demonstration came up to the police line and didn't stop. They came up the bank with a roar, just walked straight through them, over them. And the fighting that began was a total shock to me. It was like trench warfare. I suddenly realised that everything had changed, and you got, for the first time, an impression of both the power of the state and the power of the protest movement, and that it was going to be a head-on clash.
The protesters at Gisborne frightened even themselves at how far they were prepared to go, and accepted arrest in their bid to stop the tour. It was an ominous sign of what was to come.
They weren't going to stop at a police line, they weren't going to let a fence stop them, they were just going to go on, and they had the one objective of getting into the ground and stopping the games.
This time it was a victory for the Springboks, and to a lesser extent for the police. They'd kept the game going, but they'd been stretched to the limit, and they'd underestimated the anti- and pro-tour feeling, which was deeper and more malevolent than anticipated.
At the end of the day, I was arrested for rioting, It didn't make it easy for me in my work, being a social worker, working with families in this district, some who snubbed me. There were also other colleagues at work who understood where I was coming from, some who supported me, some who didn't say where they stood, but at least they talked to me. But there was one pro-rugby social worker who just wouldn't have anything to do with me. You know, he just evaded me ever since that time.
There was an uneasy truce for 5 days as police, fans and protesters prepared for round 2. Hamilton. The police had their trained riot squads, blue and red, and they now knew how far protesters were prepared to go. Although Hamilton was in the heart of rugby country, police were nervous, because whatever was to happen here, the whole world would know about it, through the first live television broadcast of the tour.
As a commentator, I was just doing the job as a broadcaster and wasn't letting any of my views on the tour intrude at all. Whether I was pro-rugby or anti the tour, didn't matter. I was going to broadcast the games. It's exactly the same reasons I broadcast games in South Africa. But as the tour went on, it was impossible not to start to form opinions. No one, I think, ever said that South Africa was okay. There was always problems with apartheid. The issue was how to deal with it and whether there should be sporting contact or whether the absence of sporting contact would bring an end to apartheid more quickly.
I would say that politics had no business in sport because it denied a lot of sports people their legitimate right to watch sport at any level. I'd been to the same ground in 1956 and watched Waikato beat the Springboks, and that gave us all a terrific expectation that we were going to see a Waikato team do it again. And unfortunately it wasn't to be.
Within our squad, people had different stands on it. Some were pro-tour, some were didn't think the tour should go ahead, but were willing to do the job. I was right into my rugby, and I guess for me it was the government had made a decision to let them come. People had a right to go to the rugby, so I guess I was pro-tour.
Here at Hamilton, the word was that the protest was going to be much more visible. There were barriers put up, but the one place that there weren't barriers is where they invaded the ground. But I think before that invasion, there was real tension.
The morning when we all went to the square was terribly exciting. It was such a huge group of people. It was a massive mobilisation of New Zealanders. It was fantastic, really. Protesting had become even more proactive than ever. Normally the protest that I was used to, it was very passive. You had your shouting and you had your placards, and that was it. But here, you know, there was a determination to do more than just stand outside and shout and carry on.
There'd been a whole group of people who had bought tickets. Their plan was to infiltrate the crowd so that we didn't have the problem that happened at Gisborne where the crowd was just inside the fence and it became impossible to get through them because they just turned on us.
We were dotted around the perimeter of the ground in the blue sort of bobby helmet and just uniform. We took all the riot gear in that, but we weren't used in that capacity because at that stage the police were still wrestling with this thing of wearing the helmets was a bit confrontational for New Zealand public, which was fair enough, you know.
We'd trained with the gear and it was the best that was available at the time, the superior stuff available now. So we were quite familiar with it and we used it a lot. There are a lot of people around, especially younger ones, that wouldn't believe the intensity, and I'm sure when they see some of the footage they won't be able to comprehend that New Zealander was against New Zealander in such a way, and the feeling how strong it was. A lot of people protested peacefully, but then you had the hardcore. And we were aware here at Hamilton that there were some protesters on the Tristram Street end, the northern end, on the bank there.
We had come into the Hamilton days earlier. We'd seen that the ground was protected on 3 sides, but not a 4th. And we could hear from our police radios that the protest movement was getting closer and closer to the ground. We heard through the radio they were coming through to the unprotected side.
There was a sudden yell. And it happened so quickly.
Hundreds of people just grabbed the fence and it just pulled it off. It just peeled off like a banana skin. And then our plants in the crowd just parted like we'd planned, and everybody started charging through. Got onto the field, got tackled by some of the cops that by that stage were wearing tracksuits and rugby boots.
Their role was to tackle anyone who ran on the field, but After about 6, they had about another 300 to go.
The protesters poured onto the field, driven along by the very potent combination of euphoria and fear.
We had a simple wooden cross, and of course a lot of people were quite puzzled. They couldn't see the connection between Christianity and protesting against the Springbok tour, and it wasn't the best place to try to explain it to them really in the middle of all that intense emotion.
If we'd got to them straight away and were able to get them moving, we would have made some progression. But the longer they stood there, they seemed to sprout roots and grow into the ground, and with their weight and numbers, no doubt, had some comfort in that.
Here were the protesters in the middle and the crowd who were going to be denied a rugby match perhaps right round the ground, and the police were probably as much wondering what on earth they were going to do as any of the rest of us were.
I could see priests, ministers, mums and dads. I could see elderly ladies, young people. It wasn't the long-haired rioting protesters that the rugby folks thought was disrupting their tour. It wasn't intellectuals who had just come rushing down from the university to protest. It was average New Zealand. It was just the people you meet and talk with every day.
When we did the training, one senior officer said, "You have to be prepared to hit man, woman, child, priest, prostitute if you go out on this tour." And I faced these 300 people, and the 30,000 rugby fans were cheering. And I thought, this is easy. We're going to be able to move these people like nothing.
There was no pattern to it, no rhyme nor reason from an observer's point of view. They weren't trying to get the protesters off. Why they would run from one end of the ground to the other and form up a line in different positions couldn't work out.
I hate just standing still, so I finally broke away from the group of protesters and went around the police. I asked one policeman if I could borrow his megaphone. For a moment I thought he was going to, and then he obviously realised it was a ridiculous thing for me to be asking, but I went around the police and said, don't forget that we're ordinary human beings just like you.
I was facing a person carrying a large wooden cross, and I thought, survival for me, if I have to hit you for the first time, my mind thought I could do it. I could go right through you. I could go through any man, woman and child that's standing there, because there was just this huge fear that I'm not standing here to protect you when I've got to survive myself and get out of here.
And then I went round the protesting crowd and said to people, stay absolutely non-violent, which was hardly necessary for me to say. They weren't in the position of being violent. They were about to have violence done to them, if anything.
They tried to physically drag them off. Well, the task was just too great for the few police resources that were there, and they had to give that up.
In the meantime, a guy had commandeered an aeroplane, and we knew from previous intelligence that this particular person was hell-bent on disrupting the game, and that he had threatened to crash into a grandstand.
That aeroplane, I was so aware of it, always buzzing around, and when the police asked the crowd to vacate the main stand here, and I knew immediately why. They were worried about that plane crashing into the stand, but they couldn't announce that. They would have been scared of a panic and all those sorts of things, I suppose.
The decision was finally made.
I just thought it was an absolute denial of our rights to watch sport.
And then the order came that we were to escort these people off the ground, and I couldn't believe it. It was probably the greatest fear I've ever had, was turning around from facing 300 people to now face 30,000 people who were screaming because their game was called off.
There was no way out of the ground except through the thousands of incensed rugby fans screaming for blood. This was a recipe for the disaster that was to come.
I'd heard of a mob, if you like, but I'd never experienced it. And to stand there and look at this sort of sea of faces, you're standing there in a blue uniform and your job is to try and stop them coming. If they wanted to go, there was no way we could have stopped them. Their mood turned very ugly. So from 2 hours previously, coming out to cheers and go for it boys and all this sort of business, as we tried to protect the demonstrators as they were escorted off the field and had to begin arresting rugby supporters who were trying to beat them up, we ended up being the villains to the rugby people as well.
As we marched towards the crowd, I thought, oh dear, what's going to happen to me? And they marched me off towards a sort of a gap in the crowd near the main entrance gates. And they just pushed me in there and left me to it. And I made my way through the crowd, and I was aware that there were some very annoyed people on either side of me.
Their path out of that ground was full of natural hazards, and they were just pelted with anything that rugby crowd could lay their hands on.
The crowd's anger exploded into violence as the rugby fans charged into the streets looking for vengeance. With no police presence outside the ground, it was left to the protesters' own medical teams to try to protect the wounded.
We're all part of the medical corps. We're all nurses. We weren't actually part of the protest that went into the park because we decided that we needed to have some safe area where people could come because we thought there would be some minor injuries. We had no idea what did happen was going to happen. I was assessing this young woman who was lying semi-conscious really, and surrounded by people. I didn't know whether they were people who were for us or against us, and suddenly, just in my line of vision, into my face came a steel boot. And I just automatically, pulled back. And it was most extraordinary. I was just stunned.
And so they decided to pick her up and pick up this person, put her in the back of the van, and treat her there. Of course, there were more people came around, and they started rocking the van, and they were yahooing and just having no regard at all for this woman.
He said, can I do anything to help? And we said, just drive the van, So Ben actually drove us out of there. I don't know how he got us out. It was just a mob surrounding us.
A couple of people started chasing the van, and then it became a target, and all these people started chasing it, We were going into the flow of people coming out of the stadium, and one guy chucked a can of Fanta, I think it was, straight through the windscreen. Full can smashed the windscreen.
At one stage I saw some man pick out, it looked like a stake from the like a steel stake, and he came running like with a javelin, as though he was running hurling a javelin to get it right through the windscreen.
And it was like in slow motion. He was going to kill us, or would have killed her if he would have got it right through the window, and he was straight at her head. But just lucky he missed. We were going forward, and as he hit the side of the van, it pierced right through the side of the van.
We were managing to make some sort of break, and we saw this line of police who were just going along and sort of trotting in formation. And we called out to them to help us because we realised that we were in real danger.
They just kept marching on blindly, one by one, in a line like bloody ducks. And it was only the last cop at the very end who turned around and tried to do something, but he just stood there dumbfounded. He didn't know what to do, and then he just rushed off and joined his mates, and they just glibly marched on again. And by that stage, these people had caught up again.
But all we knew was that we needed to get this young woman to hospital. We were quite worried about the state of her head injury.
And they attacked the back of the van. They ripped the doors open off the back of the van, and they were trying to drag this bloody woman with a split head, trying to drag her out again. And there was these people in the back trying to pull her in, and these other guys were trying to pull her out.
There were groups of people just absolutely laying into one another outside that ground. All those side streets were just littered with people holding their heads, sitting on the curb, heads bashed in, or noses broken, and it was absolute carnage.
It was a moment of growing up, of realising that we weren't some quiet little egalitarian country down the bottom of the world, full of peace and goodwill. The surface was scratched, and there was great ugliness, underneath.
I've got to say, after that game was the lowest ebb I've ever felt in the 10 years I was in the police. We were on our bus waiting to bus back to Hamilton Police Station to be debriefed. And some of these players who've been sitting around all afternoon through this whole drama, who've been psyched up to play this game for months, came onto the bus and sort of said, thanks boys, we know you did your best. And we were pretty low anyway about what had happened. And seeing these big burly macho rugby players sort of fighting back tears and so visibly upset just put us right down to the bottom.
You had people abusing you. You had people urinating out of the bus on you. You just felt ashamed.
National pride had to be restored. I, for instance, on the Monday, put up a flagpole and bought myself a New Zealand flag and flew it after the Hamilton game, and I've done so ever since, just to my way of displaying a bit of national pride.
It polarised people. I mean, people who perhaps felt marginally, just felt what was going on in South Africa was wrong, became really politicised and passionately involved in a way that maybe they never would have before.
The rugby fan felt they were being cheated of their right to watch a game of rugby. The protesters felt so strongly that the tour was wrong that there was no way of any common sense existing between the two polarised groups, and the police, media and others just caught in the middle right throughout.
New Zealanders were incredulous that such violence could occur, and many expected that the tour would now be cancelled. Instead, Muldoon committed yet more police and even called in the military.
I cannot conceive of the circumstances in which the New Zealand government would depart from its stated policy.
He had the opportunity to stop it and he didn't. And he was a man who liked to impose his will. And once he had made a decision and imposed his will, nothing was going to stop him, even though the Commissioner of Police at the time, Walton, recommended after Hamilton that the tour should be stopped.
As the tour went on and on, like every Wednesday and every Saturday, there you were out there protesting. And I must say that I had a feeling of I became numb. You knew you had to do it, but you couldn't afford to think about it anymore. It was just, I remember it as a nightmare.
By the last test in Auckland, the police thought they'd broken the protest movement. But the frustration the protesters felt at not stopping the tour had just increased their anger and willingness to fight.
I had a colleague who was in the intelligence section of the police who was actually staying with me, and he says, "There's no information about tomorrow. It looks like it's a fizzer." And I thought, you've got to be joking. This is the last day of the tour. This is the biggest city. It is the biggest Polynesian city, if you want to look at issues of race, and you're telling me there's nothing happening? And the very next day, well, the rest is history.
It was like a war. The police and protesters divided into squads and then began manoeuvring their troops until 30,000 people approached the one battleground.
Whites to the right, blacks to the left. That's the way it works.
Well, we went to every protest that we could, which I think was just about every protest that there was going in Auckland. As you can imagine, sort of the enthusiasm that you can only have when you're 15. We were totally righteous about what we were doing, free Nelson Mandela, all that sort of stuff. You know, we knew all the chants. That was the way we were brought up, and there was no question we were going to be anti-tour.
As an individual that loved rugby and loved sport, I wanted to go and watch. The decision had been made that the tour was going to go ahead, so I wanted to go and watch the games, and nothing was going to stop me.
I think we had half of New Zealand's police force up there. In those days, there was only about 5,000. We had about 2,500 up there. We were representing law and order, and here we were up against a group of people who thought they were above law and order, and that they decked themselves up as a direct challenge to what we were representing as upholding the rule of law. We were up against protesters who were quite often better equipped than we were. They had motorbike helmets that were ours, which is sort of a plastic helmet, and they were padded up with life jackets. We didn't have that sort of padding, but I think what we had was the training and the fitness. We're all very, very fit.
I thought, as an individual, as a rugby supporter, that my individual rights were being curtailed, and I didn't like this, so I became very uncharacteristically aggressive in that no one was going to stop me from going to the sport that I wanted to watch.
For the rugby fans, the only way into Eden Park was past protesters dressed for battle.
I can remember walking through the big bins, being aware of many, many police, getting to the park, walking past the Supporters Club, which was the old number 2 wooden stand in the corner of the field, looking in and feeling quite sad, seeing that it was just absolutely chock-a-block of police.
You're either one side or the other, and the vehemence of the views and the violence, the extreme violence, you know, protesters getting clobbered by members of the public simply because they were protesters and they were interfering with their beloved game.
I was looking forward to the test, and as I saw what was happening around, I couldn't believe that New Zealanders were becoming so aggressive.
That's all you are, legally armed thugs.
It was going to be the big make or break of the tour. When you see this huge sea of people and there's only a few of you in a piece of plastic they call a long batten, it was a great worry. And if they had have come through, we certainly would have been in the middle of it, probably trampled over.
Both sides were committed to violence. They just had no idea how bad it would get. Nothing, not even the weeks of protest and violence, could have prepared New Zealand for this. There was just a sea of protesters and police, a battle line drawn on every street surrounding Eden Park. It was like the worst kind of civil conflict. Total anarchy, total war.
Me and Kevin ended up with a squad called the Patu Squad, and there'll be groups that would peel away and try and wind their way through back properties, the idea being that we were going to get onto Eden Park a la Hamilton and stop the game. And then, of course, it all ended up on Onslow Road with one of the major barricades, the big rubbish bins. Me and Kevin were right in the front row. Everybody else had shields. And when we suddenly realised that we were going to attempt to breach the line, that perhaps it would be a bit of a good idea if we just... So we went about 6 rows back. And then it sort of quietened down a bit. We withdrew back. The police came forward, and that's when they started their move. And, they came forward, and that terrible sound of battens on shields and people yelling and screaming.
I remember one of our guys tripping up and the rest piling over the top of them, and we just had to form a line and drive them back.
Police and protesters were no longer fellow New Zealanders. They saw each other as the enemy.
They had these ice hockey masks which made them look like the soldiers of Star Wars coming at you, so it was completely impersonal, and they were coming at you with all sorts of bits and pieces. These shields had these little spikes, maybe a quarter of an inch, that could hardly be seen, little studs sticking out from them. So when the shields were pushed forward and moved like that, they were like slicing your clothing or whatever, and a friend of mine in the team policing unit actually had his finger severed off at the joint and into the next one. So it got beyond a peaceful demonstration. It became a sort of a battle, if you like. It was a battleground.
We did come a little bit early, just to cover it off, but we never saw any of the protesting, and then went into our changing room.
Quite an unusual feeling of tenseness because there is a light plane circling the ground and dipping in low and dropping things into the crowd.
The whole feeling of the crowd around us was one of anxiety. The barbed wire all around the field, the police everywhere.
From the players' point of view, the barbed wire, the number of police there, wasn't really an issue. We got out on the field and got stuck in and got well ahead of them.
And you can see the flower bombs are landing very close to the action there.
And this plane started getting lower and lower and lower, and I thought, hello, what's this?
I was going to take a 22 drop out and looking into where the plane was coming, and 3 or 4 flower bombs dropped around me, and I just, I didn't really know what it was. That he just he'd arrived and he dropped these things, and it put us off a little bit.
It was coming over the north stand straight at me, sitting in the south stand, and I was scared. I was petrified.
Gary Knight got hit on the side of the head, went down. We gathered round. I think Clive Norling sort of made it worse than it was in some ways. Clive came up and said to the 2 captains, basically, he thought it was time we called it off. But Gary grunted a couple of times and got up again, and that actually it epitomised the Springboks' attitude. That because Bernard Clausen said he just looked up in the sky and said, "Do you not have an air force in this country?" So that was their attitude.
Smoke bombs, flares. An attempt to come onto the field.
There was only one flare come on. There was like a smoke bomb thing. There was a lady in the crowd threw it out. Then she jumped out because the people in the crowd and the police actually on the field biffed her back in. So she'd have been wishing she hadn't. But the flare, which was a smoky sort of thing, came onto the field just as I was going to have a shot at goal at this end. In the second half when they were coming back at us, it would have been great. I missed the kick. It sort of shaved the upright, but. I could blame the flare, I suppose, but straight up, I just missed the kick.
Hit the post, bounced to Serpentine.
And they came back into it and scored 3 good tries. And so it ended up at 22 all with about a minute to go.
It was a deadlock outside the park as well. The police held their ground.
We'd achieved our objective. They weren't getting any closer to Eden Park, and we could stand there all day too. Whatever they threw at us in terms of verbal abuse, physical abuse, it didn't worry us, as long as they didn't get any closer.
But the protesters were not about to give in. They launched attacks on anything and everything, stretching the police as far as they could. They targeted the harbour bridge and the satellite station. And again they tried new tactics outside the park.
This group had gone prepared with fishing nets, of all things, and they had about 2 or 3 people in the second line back from the front, and as the group marched forward up to the cops, the front line dropped down, and these guys behind them threw these fishing nets, and it was just beautifully done, and it went right over the top of this white squad, and they were up there with their batons, and these bloody batons were stuck through the fishing net, and the cops were furious. They just went really berserk. They were right off their nuts, and they got really, really violent after that.
With the police also stretched to their limit, trying anything and everything to repel the protesters, the violence escalated. It was chaotic and brutal.
There was just like row upon row of protesters just sort of scythed down. You could see the batons being, used over the shoulder.
The protest movement itself changed quite dramatically in that people who weren't really interested in the cause were there for a fight with the police.
I was so scared. There was another row of protesters ahead of us, but then all of a sudden the police charged. There was a big roar, and then we were just taking off. They chased us all up the road, clobbering whoever they caught, and that's when the riot started, and that's when all hell broke loose. People were ripping up the wooden fence, grabbing rocks from the stone wall, people were attacking this car, and all these protesters were giving them a hard time. "Don't stop that, what are you doing?" And then the cry went up, of course, it's a unmarked police car, and they said, "Oh, well, let's turn it over then." So they trashed the car. Everybody else was either running away or lying on the ground. There was people with blood everywhere. It was, without a doubt, the most horrific thing I've ever seen.
There were no winners. All were sickened by the carnage.
Auckland that day just went berserk, and I just remember we were continually on the move the whole day, just going full on to try and protect yourself. I mean, trying to keep an impassive front, but the adrenaline was pumping through the body at 100 miles an hour, and you're virtually shaking when you came away from it, type thing. There were a few times I felt fear in the police. That was one of them, where you're actually fearing for your life.
They'd throw things at the police would charge back at us, we'd run away up to the end. The sort of ebb and flow up and down the street. It was total anarchy.
Everyone that had a bit of a grudge, anti-society type chip on their shoulder, were joining in under this banner for a good day out fun, sort of thing. From my point of view, they weren't driven by a moral righteousness or an outrage on behalf of the system in South Africa.
Alan Hewson has a chance to win the series for New Zealand. And he's done it!
The fans were ecstatic, but many New Zealanders thought the cost of victory was way too high.
Before the tour started, I'd seen the Brixton riots had beamed in from London, and I'd seen these people rampaging up and down the streets, smashing and overturning cars and things like that. And I remember those images staying in my mind thinking, aren't we lucky to be here? This would never happen in New Zealand. And of course, to suddenly face up to what happened in Auckland that day was like suddenly being in the middle of that whole scene that I'd witnessed from the safety of my lounge a year before.
Towards the end, I thought someone was going to get killed. It was just getting so intense. Things, they get out of control in a violent situation like that, and someone would die. I definitely did believe that.
Yeah, there's some things that you probably would die for, like your family. But no matter which side of that issue you looked at, I wasn't entirely convinced that a game of footy was one of them.
I got a rock in the back at Eden Park. My squad that day consisted of 18. 11 of them went to hospital with broken arms, broken legs, broken ankles, broken shoulders, broken fingers. And at the end of the day, I remember Phil Key was saying, "Gather your squad and escort the Springboks." And I said, "What with? I've only got 7 left."
I can remember walking out through the number 1 car park and seeing rows and rows of policemen and seeing them covered in absolute muck, blood, eggs, dirt, and some of them were just kids. And I really was saddened, and I think the sad thing about it for me is I don't remember the football.
It was over, but for many it seemed it would never end. The repercussions would go on and on.